wonder what you're like at waiting. Many of us over these last months have got quite used to having to wait outside supermarkets, waiting to be let in. Some of us might have found it harder than others to do that waiting. I often think of my lovely husband, who's a master at nipping in and out of lanes on motorways in order to avoid having to wait in traffic. Maybe you're a bit like that. Often, of course, and this certainly applies to me, we struggle with waiting because our lives are so packed full that if we have to wait unexpectedly, we'll find ourselves late for our next appointment. But of course, sometimes the agony of waiting goes much deeper than just the frustration of having to sit in a traffic jam or wait outside to be allowed into the supermarket. On those kinds of occasions, we can wait, knowing that probably it won't be long before the wait is over and all will be fine. And so it's not too difficult to wait then, albeit with some frustration. But what about times when the waiting is so much harder? These last few months have been filled with waiting, and not just in supermarket queues. Waiting for lockdown to end. Waiting for a vaccine to be produced. Waiting for life to go back to normal, whatever normal might be. And so it goes on. For many, there have also been times of incredibly painful loss. How do we wait in times of grief, in times of uncertainty like these? Not surprisingly, the Bible gives us some clues. In the Old Testament, the Hebrew word for hope can be translated as wait. So when we read in the Psalms and the prophets about hoping in God, they're often talking about waiting for God. Waiting and hoping for God are often inextricably linked. I read today Psalm 130, and verses 5 and 6 say this: I wait for the Lord, my soul waits, and in his word I hope. My soul waits for the Lord, more than those who watch for the morning. More than those who watch for the morning. We're encouraged to wait in times of struggle, in times of pain, in times of uncertainty, but to wait in hope. But notice we're not called to wait in hope, and a hope that is dependent on our circumstances necessarily changing, but in a hope that is based on the faithfulness of God, on the character of God. If you look back at some of the writers in the Bible, think, for example, of Hosea, the prophet who was writing during those very dark days when the people of God were being oppressed, and it felt like their lives would never end, this time of hardship would never end. He remembered God's faithfulness as he went back to recounting how God had brought them out of Egypt. He goes back to remembering how God has been faithful in the past. And then, of course, we go on into the New Testament and the life of Jesus, and then, of course, his death and his resurrection, and the writers and the people that came after that who often would go back to saying, remember Jesus' resurrection, his defeat over death. Remember how God, again, was faithful. He revealed himself as a faithful God who brings new life. And so it's out of that we can then hope in the promises of God for the future, that one day the kingdom really will come in all its fullness. One day there really will be no more pain or suffering. We can depend on that because of what we have seen in the past. We can have faith that God's promises are true. And so we have a choice as to how we live through these challenging times. We can continue to wait during these times of uncertainty, basing our hope on our circumstances. The problem with that is that depending on our circumstances, we might be left with no hope at all, or we might be left with a hope that can be shattered as soon as our circumstances become less favourable. Or we can choose to base our hope in our rock of salvation, in our God, who is so utterly faithful and who does promise to bring us to a new and certain life, however long we have to wait. In God we wait, and in God we hope, knowing that we can trust in him. So as we continue in these days of uncertainty, who do you choose to put your hope in? Amen.